Hello, everyone. I just wanted to give you some lesson three feedback after grading all of your assignments. So, seems like everyone has a pretty good handle on the concepts, but I just wanted to go over a couple of things. Number one, the difference between optimize and maximize. So, most of you have, I think, a pretty good sense of what that is. But I think it's important to remember the context here is really the big picture is, so optimization is sort of making the best. As opposed to the biggest economy. Um, so quality over quantity. Um, and the sort of tying it into everything else, like the steady state economy concept. The main premise here is that the steady state economy, remember, does not focus on economic growth. What it wants to do is actually improve the quality of life for most people. So quality of life is really the ultimate goal within ecological limits. So those are really the two main aspects of the steady state economy. Absolutely have to be within ecological limits. So globally, one or less um, quote unquote Earth of ecological footprint. That is it's fundamental. Okay, so that's the sort of biophysical limitations that we're living with. And as you saw, we are exceeding those. Um, Overall, especially in wealthier countries like the United States, where we're using more resources and are actively replenished. So we can't do that. Okay, that's the one of the absolute essential aspects of the steady state economy. Remember, the second aspect is that we don't particularly care about income, actually. Really, we care about how people are doing in their quality of life. If that, if by providing more economic resources and higher salaries and a salary floor and all that sort of thing, minimum wage, if that helps people obtain a higher quality of life, then that's great. But ultimately, all we truly care about is quality of life. Okay, so that is an optimization effort. We're trying to optimize the economy, create the optimal economy, not just the biggest. So we don't steady state economy folks, they don't care about growing GDP. And in fact, most of them are very skeptical of it because, as you've seen, and as I think you have a really good sense of, growing GDP usually means that we're just, reducing our resource base, we're destroying environmental resources, we're taking advantage of low income and other marginalized people across the world. So there are all these negative outcomes of growing GDP historically. I mean, just look at what's happening right now with inequality and inequity, and the rich just getting richer and most of the money going toward the top, and how the global inequity um, really got worse during the pandemic. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence that despite the fact that GDP's been growing, um, it's not necessarily been good for all people, and that's really the point of the steady state economy. Is that we want to have an economy that works for all the people, that promotes high quality of life for everyone, um, and doing that all within ecological limits. Okay, and that kind of speaks to this notion of Herman Daly's notion of development, not growth. Um, so again, most of you had a pretty good sense of this, but the idea behind distinguishing between development and growth is really really important. And I think if you pay attention, and maybe now you will if you haven't been already, just listen to the news. Listen to, doesn't matter your news source. Could be the NPR, or the MSNBC's, the kind of left or the right wing stuff like Fox News. Um, you're going to hear about this GDP growth as the goal, and they're always talking about GDP growth like it's some magic number that just says if we reach this, it's going to be good for everybody. And that's, even though they don't say that, that's the implication. Otherwise, why would we focus on GDP growth? Okay. And so Daly is saying, like, look, GDP growth is not the goal. The goal is really to make sure we have an economy that works for all the people. Okay. And further, by growing the GDP, we've done all these other things like using non-renewable resources and taking advantage of people and so forth. And he says that we need to distinguish, like, sustainable growth is also just physically impossible. If you think about the term, it's an oxymoron. You can't sustain growth of anything with finite resources on a finite planet. You just can't do it. And he said, like, at least start with that basic level, right? That realization. and you kind of see the absurdity of it all. But he says that we can continue to develop our economy, and that a non-growing economy doesn't mean that it's stagnant, right? So we can still have people buying and selling goods and remaking goods and reusing goods and using renewable energy as much as you want. So it's constantly changing or developing, but not necessarily growing. Okay, so that's the importance there. He also offers some really interesting policy mechanisms that I think if you didn't really, I know it's a little bit of a dense reading, but he offers some really good ideas in there. And one of them he mentioned, and a few of you mentioned something like this in your solutions, is it's a good idea to sort of tax or otherwise get some money from these things that are damaging to the environment, like fossil fuel extraction, for example, and use that money to fund things that are good for the environment, good for people, good for renewable energy, and so forth. And Daly mentions this in his article as well. And I just want you to know that that's actually something that people do. In fact, the state of Delaware is part of a what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. It's a carbon cap and trade regional cap and trade um, agreement with a bunch of states on the East Coast, like New Jersey and Vermont and so forth. And so the short story is all power plants in Delaware of a certain size have a certain limit on their emissions that they can, CO2 emissions. And if they have too many emissions, what they can do is they can buy if another power plant has less emissions than they're allowed. Okay, so you have this like cap, this allotment. If I go over and someone else goes under their cap, what I do is I buy from them, and then that sort of raises and balances the thing out. So it creates a market for emissions. Anyway, so Delaware is part of this RGGI, and so there's actually they sell these credits every year. RGGI does, and they take that money. So they raise a bunch of money when they auction off these carbon credits every year, and they actually take that money and fund a whole bunch of things in the state of Delaware. So most of the energy equity and energy efficiency initiatives in the state, at least a lot of them, are actually funded by this money that's effectively a tax on fossil fuels. So it's a really good idea, and I know some of you had that independently, and Daly mentions it as well, but this works in the real world. There's all kinds of examples of this all over the place. So I just want to know that these are practical things that we're talking about here, and they are, in some instances, real policy solutions. I found some of your answerings about, excuse me, yeah, answering some of your answers about the rising tide lifting all boats. If you have a boat, I found those answers interesting. Um, I think the sort of the main point that's important to get from, I think Dan O'Neill is his name in that presentation, among other things. But in this specific context, he's trying to say, as the economy grows, as GDP goes up, it's not good for everyone, right? So if you have the sort of, wealthy and you have the low income folks, generally speaking, as GDP goes up, the wealthy, and you can pick your data now, like this is evident all over the place, as the GDP goes up, the wealthy's income goes up disproportionately relative to the low income or even moderate income folks. And I think I showed some charts in the presentation, but middle class wages have basically flatlined since the early 1980s, whereas the wealthy have just gone up tremendously. So if you haven't had a chance, look at those graphs that I posted. So the point, Dan, Mr. O'Neill's point is that um, growing GDP, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not. But to assume that when the GDP grows, that everybody benefits from it is just not true. I mean, look what happened during the pandemic. There was that GDP drop, and then it just grew like crazy. But a lot of the lower income folks, it's basically increased the division between the wealthy and the poor. Okay, so that's a really important takeaway as well. Yeah, and I think that's really the main feedback. So again, I think you all had a pretty good sense of all of this, but I guess my goal, for lack of a better term, is for you to really think about these um, like this terminology that you hear, these assumptions that are made when, even if they're not directly stated, they're implied. Like GDP growth is good, period, right? Like that's it. It's just good. And as you saw, there was so much more to GDP. as we got into lesson 5 in particular, that the GDP doesn't tell even close to the whole story. And I'll address this more in lesson 5. But I hope that it helped you sort of rethink this focus on limitless growth and how, first of all, that's not possible on a finite planet. But secondly, is that really what we should be striving for? Or should we be more concerned about making sure everything's within ecological limits and that people are actually improving their quality of lives? Okay. All right. So that's it. I will follow up with the lesson 4 soon.